Alright, so today we're going to go have a look at some of the some advanced preflop stuff, looking through these preflop simulations, getting some ideas about how to correctly play preflop. If you have any questions, just jump in and ask. If you want to type them, you can type them as well. Alright, so I guess we'll start with the small versus big blind. So this is what the strategy sort of looks like for the small one versus big blind. As you can see, there's a fair chunk of the calling range, you know, and this is for a 5% rate capped at 1 big blind. Fair amount of calling in sort of the preflop strategy, 17.7, and then the rest is sort of raised. Been raised, not used that often. 2.5, which is a 75%, pretty good. Pot pretty good, and then the rest of them sort of tapering off from there. So in terms of the size that you would want to be using, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, they're all probably quite acceptable sizes to be using. And of course, mixing between them is even better. In terms of the hands that you would want to choose, like a hand like Ace 2 offsuit, it's a pretty trash hand, loses to 7-6 a lot. So on the 3, 4, 5, so that's usually why Ace 2 isn't very happy. Even though the ranges are very wide. Ace 3 on the other hand, a little better, doesn't have that sort of reverse implied odds with its straight draw, except to get the 6-3, but you know there's not going to be much 6-3 offsuit in there. Even then, it still just goes for a limp all the time. So when you're looking down at Ace 3 offsuit in the small blind, and I'm running a second simulation in the spot currently, which sort of reveals the same thing. Always call. Other kinds of hands that you just want to always call, stuff like this: 10-4 suited, Jack 3 suited, very high frequency calls, and King 7 off, and Queen 8 off kind of stuff. So sort of the hands that you want to play, but just quite aren't strong enough to raise. Makes it into a high frequency call. On the other hand, the hands that basically never call are these suited broadways. Alright, Ace King suited, Ace Queen suited, Ace Jack suited, Ace 10 suited, all the way down to Jack 10 suited. Like basically those suited Broadway type hands almost never call. They usually make it in for a raise. Here you can see that the 75% frequency is used, and the 100% frequency pretty often, but sometimes you can bump up to a slightly larger size. So those sort of hands basically never call, and so when we look into this strategy a bit deeper, we'll see them still in there because the calling frequency is very minute, and so those kinds of hands will do something different and look a bit strange. So you can just sort of ignore them in the limp re-raise strategy. As for the pocket pairs, basically, the higher up you go, the more often you're going to raise. Kings is a bit of an exception there. It does like to do the limp re-raise a fair bit of the time, but yeah, aces, really limps. Some of these sort of suited aces, kings and queens, those kinds of hands can go for a limp call, as well as for a raise. Any questions about sort of the opening strategy? Sorry, that's my cat in the background. All right, so yeah, You call.
Hi, Thomas.
Yep.
Yeah. Uh, are these solutions based on the ranges on the Zenith site?
No, these are solved from scratch.
Right. Okay. Okay. And this is based on.
It's
Yeah.
based
No, it's
on
okay.
5%
That's right.
capped at one big blind, right?
Right. So it's sort of.
100
Okay.
big blinds deep. Uh,
Okay.
yeah. So once again, so if we call, this is sort of what the big blind strategy will be. Green being checked. Um, as you can sort of see, it's difficult to see with that sort of aspect ratio. But all the strong hands, all the suited connected hands, make it in. The sort of railways make it in. A fair chunk of the suited gappers as well make it into the raising range. All the suited wheels raise over a limp, and then in the bottom left hand corner you've got these sort of high card junk type hands, like an ace-2 offsuit always makes it in. Ace-5 offsuit, high frequency. Ace-5 is a fairly strong hand. King-6, once again, the 6 for the king is a pretty good hand, pretty good kicker to have for the king, just because it makes more straights. So you can sort of have a bit of a closer look through that, but a good mix of hands. Never sort of raising any total crap. So it's not going to be raising like 7-2, 7-2 offsuit, 3-2 offsuit, all that junk. So you don't really raise them. Instead, pick a hand with a decent blocker at least to the raise. All sort of the suit and connectivity, which makes sense. In terms of the sizes here in this sim, I'm running another sim right now that goes into some bigger sizes over the top, so it'll have 250 and 300. But the size most often used is 125. So here, if they limp, you raise it to 3.5. But sizes bigger than that can be used as well. But smaller than that, much less often used. So over a limp in the small blind, if you're in the big blind, make it pretty chunky. You can even when the other sim is completed, you'll see that you can do weird shit. Like if they limp for the one big blind, you can like make it like 7 big blinds, and with the correct range, of course, and that's totally acceptable. But 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, all those are pretty good sizes that you can use over a limp. But 3 less often, 2.5 doesn't make any sense, and half and 2 big blinds, it doesn't make too much sense to be raising the limp. You want to go for the bigger sizes to sort of reflect the polarity in your range, right? And get some extra polarity in there, so make it nice and big. And this is sort of the failures of other sims that don't have sort of these mixed sizes, right? This wide range of sizes. They'll only have 1 or 2 sizes, and because of that, there's not enough polarity available, and so a lot of junk gets added into it. So you'll see that the ranges just be a bit strange. Few things to notice is just to sort of remember hands that you don't want to raise, like a king jack off, queen jack off. So those hands become very, very strong in the limp check pot, because you have really good. Basically you have top at that stage if you make a pair with either of those hands, because the hands stronger than that aren't going to really be in either player's range. Now here's an interesting thing, over a raise, right? This is sort of the range that continues. So this is limp, right, to 1 big blind, raise to 3.5, and now we're looking at the small blind strategy against that. You can't even see it up here, right? But basically, the size that's most often used is 200. So like it'd be limp raised to 3.5, and then the small blind, when they choose to go for the limp re-raise, they pop it to 17.5. 17.5, yeah, which is a pretty big raise, right? And they're doing it with a very polar range. So if you can try and ignore the suited connected, the suited Broadway stuff, because that's not really even in the limping range, because those always basically always raised. The pocket pairs, 9s plus, and these offsuit aces, ace king offsuit, ace queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit, ace 10 offsuit, beta king queen offsuit, they all make it in and go for this really big 200% raise size. So you've got king 2 suited. So we're talking limp, make it 3.5, raise to 17.5. And that's sort of confirmed in the other sim that I'm running. It's 200% is the size that's most often used there. 250 isn't really used as often. So yeah, if you're going to go for a limp re-raise in the small blind, make the re-raise real big. And part of the reason why that is you just don't want to get min 4-bet, because getting min 4-bet isn't so great. Here there isn't a min 4-bet size in the other sim that I'm running. It does have a min 4-bet size, but even against the 50% 4-bet size, you're basically just jamming your entire continue range. As you can see, the extra polarity allows you to just play fold and jam against a 4-bet if you go for the limp re-raise to this very big size. So yeah, any questions about that? Oh, also, like if against bigger sizes, it's pretty much the same sort of range that you're looking at. Like if they make it a bigger size, you're still raising the 9s, still raising the 9s, still raising the 9s. So don't get thrown off if you're going to limp in a small blind with like 9s and they make it a very big size. You still want to be raising against it. You might not necessarily have to raise for 200% pot, but here 125% ends up being the same, roughly the same amount of stack that you put in, which is 17.5 big blinds. So it goes limp, raise to 5, pop it back up to 17.5, right? With the same sort of range, right? The 9s and the offsuit aces, and a bit of other stuff. So any questions about the small blind limp strategy? No? Is that making sense to everyone? Okay, so we'll go back and have a look at some of the raises. If we go through and look at all this, here, if we go 2.5 and 3, if we just quickly filter through the different raise sizes that we have for the small blind. If we just go a big broad overview, you can see that the big blinds counter strategy, right? The hands that they're going to be 3-betting you with are pretty similar. Okay, no matter what size that you use. Okay, so here let's just have a look at the 3x. We're talking pocket pairs, 7s, 8s, even a little bit of 6s, above definitely most of the 9s, and that's going to be the same regardless of all the sizes, right? So 9's just going to get it in with a 3-bet, and then continue against a 4-bet. Notice that you've got ace 2 against these sort of smaller sizes. Ace 2 always makes it in there unless ace 3 starts to think about folding against this 3.5x open size. But yeah, ace 2 always goes for the 3-bet. But sort of in general, you notice that you've got pocket pairs, ace queen plus, and then you're thinking stuff like ace 10 plus, or at least ace jack plus, and some of the other sort of broadways, a fair chunk of the suited connectors, right? If you look at it like this, it's probably a bit easier to see, but basically a fair chunk of the suited connectors, at least at some frequency, and then just this offsuit sort of junk that you wouldn't have. It's just a little bit difficult to call these hands. So you, with their sort of blockers, you chuck it into the 3-bet range appropriately. Similarly, this sort of suited suited junk towards the right hand side of the matrix makes it in if it can't call. Right. So yeah, any questions about the 3-bet range? I mean, you can if you run through all of it, you sort of see the same sort of hands. Like we're talking, like ace queen really likes it, ace queen off, ace jack suited, king queen suited. Those are sort of the hands that just always, basically always get in there. Against the slightly bigger sizes, some calls, but other than that, you've got some of the other sort of kings, and then a bunch of suited hands. All right, so yeah, let's just follow through this a bit more often, and just in terms of looking at the different sizes. Yeah, let's have a look at the different sizes. So here against the 2.5, right? You're using quite a big size as a response. So 125 to 150, and even basically around 125, 150 against the 2.5. Against the 3, 100, 125, and so and then against the 3.5, around 100, right? Against the 4, 100, 170, and 75. Against the 4.5, 75. Against the 5, 75. So the bigger their open size that they choose to use, the smaller your 3-bet size, and vice versa. The smaller your smaller their open size, the bigger your 3-bet size, and that's just as a percentage of the pot, and it ends up being roughly the same amount of chips that you put in. So if they opened to 2.5 instead of just making it 3x, regardless of what size that they choose, you're gonna make it roughly the same number of chips that you put in. So for example, if we go from 100 and then 100, and that's like goes from 3 to 9, or 125, 3 to 10.5 big blinds, and here 125 over 2.5, that's a 9 to 10. Against a 3.5, make it 100 is 10.5. So we're talking, against these different open sizes, something like around 10, 11 big blinds is a 3-bet size, regardless of not really regardless, but in terms of a response against this sort of range of open sizes. When they get up to 4, right, you're talking 175. So like 75, 100 would be 3x is 12, and 75 is 10. So you're talking between 10 and 12 big blinds, and sort of you see that sort of pattern continue throughout. Against a 5x open, 75 is 12.5. Right. So any questions about that? So we're talking about using roughly the same. So if you like in the big blind a certain 3-bet size, just instead of changing your 3-bet size in terms of the percentage of the pot, sorry, in terms of the of the number of big blinds that you use. You use the same number of big blinds, and then that changes roughly the percentage of the pot that you're using. Of course, there is a bit of elasticity in that. So if you like a range between sort of like 10 and 12 big blinds as your 3-bet size, then just stick with that. Any questions about that? Has that been clear as mud?
Yeah, I've got a question, Thomas. So this is is this a 3-way sim, right?
Yeah, it's a 3-way sim. Forced the button to fold.
Yeah, so this would be sort of similar if it folded to the button.
This is if it folded to the small blind.
Folded to the small blind. Yeah, okay, I'm with you. So yeah, okay, that's cool. Yeah, good. And these sims are available if I buy the book, yeah.
They'll be available once the book launches for free for everyone. But if you want to get it early, you can buy the book.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can just wait until the beginning of next year.
Yeah.
And they'll be available.
Sorry, I also have a question.
Yeah.
Are the blocker effects affecting this too much? This simulation?
The blocker effects of the button folding. Yeah, I mean, they're very minute. I mean, if you look at like the different sims and Snowy, it's only a couple percent here and there.
Okay.
So I have just a quick question, Thomas. The various raise sizes. You mentioned, and it looks like as far as the value hands, the range of value hands is similar with each size, but the level of, as you increase the level of polarity, are we adding more like pseudo bluffs with the higher raise amounts? Like, is the range?
I mean, so the bigger sizes, the more polar the range is the main thing, right? So here, if you can sort of see and focus in on the red a little bit, relatively polar in terms of what's used, but all the hands are sort of the same, mixing in between each other.
So there's a lower
like,
frequency.
There's different frequencies. So for example, here in the red, right, you can't really see King 8 offsuit being in there, and Ace 6 suited and Ace 5 suited, that they're not really in there. So there's some hands that you don't use for certain sizes, but for the most part, if a hand's strong enough to raise, it's strong enough to go into any of the different sizes. So there might be certain sizes that I prefer slightly more often, slightly less often. But you're thinking about sort of polarity overall is what's going on.
So as the size increases, a lot of the middling hands aren't making it into that higher range.
It's not that it's not making it, just less often.
Less often, okay.
Yeah, so sort of intuitively, the larger the raise size, the smaller the frequency polarity.
Yeah, I mean, so say for like, if you look at the red, we'll zoom in a bit. If you look at the red, so it's a 4x open, okay? If you compare the frequency that pocket twos does it to like kings, right? You can see that twos doesn't do it as often as kings does. Right, so the middling hand twos doesn't raise for 4x as often as kings does, right? They're a very strong hand, and sort of vice versa, right? So there's sort of like bluff ace 5, right, makes it in, but sort of this middling hand ace 8 offsuit doesn't really make it into the 4x size at all. So here, this ace 5 offsuit's a very obvious bluff, but like ace 5 suited is not quite as obvious. So it's not being raised for the 4x open size as often. Maybe it's a little bit more clear if we sort of compare the different 3-bet sizes. Yeah, that's not quite as clear. Maybe this one. Yeah, maybe this one. Like you can compare the yellow and the red in terms of the two different sizes, and sort of which kinds of hands does what more often. The middling kinds of hands go more for the yellow, and the slightly further out kinds of hands, like 9-2 suited as a bluff, ace-2 off suited as a bluff, used more often in the red, which is 150 compared to the 125. Of course, there's not a huge difference in terms of the size between 150 and 125, but it's appreciable in terms of what kinds of hands makes it in. So the bigger the raise size as an open or a 3-bet or a 4-bet or whatever, really as a 4-bet because sometimes you run into a jam. But definitely for opens and 3-bets, slightly more polar.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, so let's just move on and talk about 4-bet. Let's say we open, you get a 3-bet to you say you open a 3 and you get 3-bet to 10.5. The 4-bet size is that we're going to use, and it's sort of the same thing throughout. And I know there's no min 4-bet for this, but basically the 4-bet size is going to be a 2x or a little bit over 2x for this out of position player, not really the 3x or pot sized 4-bet that you see in other ranges. All right, closer to 2x. So let's have a look at this. So we open a 3, they 3-bet to 10.5, and then here 50% is a 2x 4-bet. There isn't a min, but even if I did add a min, it would still prefer the 50%, which is the other sim that I'm running. Goes to 21 big blinds as your 4-bet. Maybe you can go slightly bigger to sort of reflect the added polarity, like this ace king off likes to go really big, kind of stuff. And with these is really big as in they're jamming. So here you get some jams over the 3-bet with the ace king off, ace queen off, queen jack suited, and pocket tens. And you're going to see that throughout the small blind versus big blind sims, that sort of pattern of which hands you want to jam, instead of go for the 2x 4-bet. Here, for example, you open to 3, they 3-bet to 9. You know, the kinds of hands that you can chuck in a jamming range: tens, queen jack suited, king jack suited, ace queen off, ace king off. You can just jam it in for 100 big blinds there, to sort of win that 12 big blinds that's in the pot right now. You know, once again, even for a smaller open size against a smaller open size, and a smaller 3-bet size, not quite as many jams. Definitely when it gets a bit bigger, right, the slightly bigger 3-bet size, you're going to have some more jams. And definitely when they go even bigger, you're going to have more jams. If we open a 3.5 and then get 3-bet to 10.5, you know, plenty of shoving there. So there's plenty of shoving to be done if your opponent makes 3-bets that are a bit too big. And it's pretty important to have a shoving range over the big 3-bets, because it sort of prevents your opponent from not being polar. It sort of forces your opponent to be somewhat polar when they 3-bet you, because they're just going to face a jam some percentage of the time. So yeah, that's cat's eating its collar. Anyway, yeah, so that sort of how we're going to be playing the 4-bets. Of course, the calling range is sort of going to reflect the size, but roughly the range that is 4-bet is going to be pretty much the same, regardless of, in terms of the value range that's 4-bet is going to be pretty much the same, regardless of which 3-bet sizes they use, and even which open size that we use. It's the same kinds of hands that are going to be getting it in, right? And so we're talking like 10s plus, even a bit of 9s. Definitely ace queen plus. They're all quite happy to get it in big blind versus small blind. And then against the 2x 4-bet or whatever 4-bet size that your opponent wants to use, you're going to be just flatting the aces, right, and jamming sort of this other stuff. Ace, king, queen, jacks, 10s, bit of queen, jack suited. Queen, jack suited is a really nice jamming hand, small blind versus big blind, because it blocks both queens and jacks, has good equity against ace, king, as well as good equity against the pocket pairs, the weaker pocket pairs, 10s and 9s that calls. So it's it's pretty nice hand to have, because it's not dominated by the ace king. I mean, it is dominated by ace queen, but in terms of how strong ace queen king queen jack suited is in the 3-bet pot as a call, right? Like queen jack suited isn't super strong because it gets dominated a bit too easy, and the sort of straights that it makes is a little bit less common, just because of the distribution of hands that your opponent has. You know, one of those cards is going to be blocked likely, so it's slightly less often to make a straight. So for those reasons, it turns out that the queen jack suited and king jack suited kinds of hands makes for good jamming as above.
That's because it blocks the ace king straights.
No, so queen jack suited likes to jam because it blocks queens. This is for specifically small blind. This is big blind, because it blocks queens and jacks. When it gets it in against ace. Let's just have a look. So when we jam, right, ace queen offsuit is going to fall a little bit. So against ace king, that's always going to call. Like, we're not dominated. So when we make a queen or jack, we can outdraw it. But all these pocket pairs below, like 10s and below, we're flipping against. So it's pretty good blockers, pretty decent equity against the calling range, and doesn't do quite so well in the 3-bet pot. So that's why it can 4-bet jam and 5-bet jam kind of stuff.
Okay.
And you're gonna see that sort of trend throughout with the queen jack suited specifically. All right, looking here, jack suited, queen jack suited, likes to do it. So what was I? So open 3-bet, min 4-bet. Sorry, not min 4-bet. 4-bet to 2x, and then this is sort of what the jamming range looks like. So yeah, double blocker makes it for a decent jam. Yeah, 5-bet jam the queen jack suited. 5-bet jam the queen jack suited. So part of what's going to be going on is you're going to have to know sort of what hands go where, how far you're going to take what hands in terms of whether you're going to make it into a 4-bet calling range or a 5-bet jamming range or whatever. So for example, queen jack suited, open, right? Pretty often called, but when it does 3-bet, it just goes nuts. Queen jack suited against the 4-bet, it just jams. So it's one of those things that you should remember, sort of which hands will 5-bet jam, which hands will call. Aces and kings often will just flat a 4-bet aces far more often than kings. But the other pocket pairs, queens definitely, jacks and tens, they like to just get it in against a full bet.
A question,
Yeah.
Tom? Thomas? It seems like the sim has it seems to like the 50% pot for bet.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
And well, it kind of reminds me of like Snowy in a way.
Yeah, that's what Snowy does. Yeah.
So the questions that I had when I saw Snowy doing this is that it just seems to give the small blinds like really good odds to continue.
The big line, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So say we get 3-bet to 10.5. Let's just have a look at the Snowy range. So the pot. Snowy doesn't have a 75%, so I imagine against pot, Snowy would use 75% bit more. But yeah, good odds to continue, so they have to continue very wide, and then you're going to make a small bet on the flop with the majority of your range.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so these sims post flop have been run with an underbet 25%, sort of normal bet size, either 50 or 75%, depending on how deep the stacks are, as well as an overbet 200-250% post flop. So post flop, I mean, you're not going to have any issues with the ranges in terms of the sizing, not having enough post flop sizes, because these sims have got a good post flop tree or a post flop tree that's reasonable in terms of the range of bet sizes that can be used, including down to 25%, which I imagine is pretty often in these sort of out of position type stuff. So yeah, I mean, Snowy is definitely correct in their small line. This is a big blind to be 4-betting for this sort of small size, and then using that 25% bet size on the flop against a wide range.
And Snowy figured that out in a different method than the way current solvers have figured that out.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so any other questions about small one versus big blind? When the other sim comes out, I'll chuck it up. It'll confirm most of this. There'll be some slight differences, but the overall trend will be the exact same. The overarching themes will be the same between the two sims. Any questions about small one versus big blind?
No, that was interesting. That was good.
All right, let's move on. Okay, so that's annoying. Yeah, button opening. I mean, this medium accuracy one isn't great, so let's have a look at that. So there's these two high accuracy ones, the high accuracy low precision and sort of the high accuracy poor precision. Both pretty good. So here I've given 3 sizes, probably not enough. To be honest, I might go and rerun another sim with a 100% size as well at some stage. But with the 3 sizes, we can see that overall it's 2.5 as an open size is pretty good. 2 is still used. 3 open sizes is still used. But here with these sims, because it only goes up to 3, the bigger sizes might usually just ends up getting squeezed into it. So like the bigger size that you don't see, right? Like 3.5, 4, 5, whatever. Those tiny percentages get squeezed into the top one. So yeah, I mean 2.5 is pretty good open size, but anywhere between 2 and like 3 is fine for me. And if you're getting better at your pre-flop, you're going to want to mix. So use a mix of different hands to try and exploit your opponents. So looking here in particular, the pink is the 3x, and the blue is the 2x, and the yellow is the 2.5. And you can sort of see the polarity in the 3x open, right? You got to have these more of these sort of offsuit hands. Offsuit ace x being used more in the 3. More of these sort of weaker suited, basically suited junk in the top right, more often than in the 3. On the other hand, like the low pocket pairs, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, more often in the 2x open size. And sort of these middling suited type hands, ace 8 offsuit, king 8 suited type stuff, quite likes the 2x open size. And that's the same sort of thing that you would see between these two sims that are run. Same sort of thing. All right, so let's just focus on this bottom one, so I'm not going to repeat myself too often. Against the different open sizes, the 3-bet sizes once again will sort of change. Let's have a look at against the 2x open first. So against the 2x open, so we've got quite a range of sizes in response. In this first sim, I only went up to 250. In the second sim, I've spread things out a little bit. So you can take that however you want. With the 225 here being used a bit more often, a bit less often here, and also there's no 100 and down underneath, which sort of changes things, because here you got substantially different sort of calling ranges but between the two, and that's sort of got to do with the size of the squeeze from the small blind calling range. Anyway, so let's have a look at this bottom one. So against the 2x open, these ranges are very similar to what I have up in terms of the calling, to the kinds of hands that we'll want to call. But you notice one difference is that here with the small blind, I've allowed it to have flats in the small blind, and against the 2x, all these pocket pairs will flat all the way down to 2s, and even against the 3x, sometimes 2s will flat. Obviously, there's nowhere near as much calling in the small blind against the 3x than against the 2x, but there's quite a bit of flatting in the small blind. If you notice here, 7.5% calls versus what's this, like 14-ish percent, 13-14% raising range against the 2x open. Against slightly bigger open, there's much less calls, and sort of the hands that would have called goes into raising instead. And against the bigger one, there's not a lot of calls and far more raising. So yeah, in the small blind you can have some flats, but the kinds of hands that flat are sort of very fairly middling, and you got to pay attention to which hands you're gonna do this play with, which is specifically the flat and then back jam over the squeeze. So let's have a look at that against the 2x open. So with the 2x open, there's a flat, and now here the big blind has got the choice of which hands, which kind of size that they want to squeeze. So here between 50 and 150 against the 2x, and here it's just against the calls 125 is the smallest one. But let's say we look at the 150 squeeze, right? Once the button folds, okay, we've got the small blind. The small blind's strategy is to rarely call and then Basically, the calling range is 16.1%, so not a lot of calls, and then the jamming range is 7%. So the hands that jam is 10s, 9s, 8s, and ace queen, and some of the other stuff, king jack suited in particular. Against a pot size squeeze, same sort of hands. Do that. Jamming range consisting of 9s, king jack suited, ace queen suited. So the moral of the story is, if you're going to have flats in the small blind, you're going to want to consider which hands you're going to use for the back jam over the squeeze once the button calls. So once the button folds. Once the button folds, it's basically going to be 9s, 10s, and then ace queen. And it's sort of, it's difficult to tease apart what's for value and what's not, because there's already so much in the middle, and the opponent's gonna fold. So definitely 10s is a value, 9s is questionable for value, and ace queen is questionable for value. But yeah, so that's the back jam over the squeeze. But if there's a call, once so button opens, you call in the small blind, big blind squeezes, button calls, you're not calling at all. You will have some back jams still, right? But you're not going to call. Is essentially the moral of the story there. Right. Here there's a few more calls, because the squeeze size is relatively small. So where was I? Yeah. So there's a few calls that you can have when the squeeze size is very small. Only 100 versus the 150. But the hands that squeeze jam are the same. So like 10s, 9s, ace queen, king jack suited, some ace jack suited, and the other stuff. If you really want to play the multi-way pot, multi-way 3-way pot position, you can, if the squeeze size is small. Let's have a look at that again against the bigger open size. If you do choose to flat against the 2.5, right? And then you face a squeeze, and then they call. Same kind of hands are re-jamming, are back jamming all in, and then the same sort of hands will make it into the calling range as the over call. Yeah, fold. So yeah, any questions about the small blind call and then back raise? Same kind of hands, regardless of what's going on. 10s and 9s, ace queen, ace jack suited, king jack suited. So yeah, I mean this is the kinds of things that you got to be thinking about before you make the call. All right. So like when you're thinking a bit more exploitatively, you're just like, okay, against this player, will I be comfortable back jamming this hand? If no, then you can just not have any back jams, and then for the exploitative reasons, and then just raise it pre-flop. Specifically, that's 10s and 9s, because some of their equity, so some of their expectation for the calling comes from the ability to back jam against the squeeze. All right, so that's the small blind calling and then back jamming. So look at the different sizes that the small blind's going to be using against the different open sizes. So here, against the 2x, you can see it's 200%. It's like in the 200%. And once again here, against the 2x with this other sim, it's like in like the 175 to 200. So that's against the 2x open size versus against the 2.5 open size, like in the 150, and then against the 3x open size, it's like in between 100 and 150. And you see this the same sort of pattern happening here against the 2.5. It's like in the 150 and a little bit more of the 125, and against the 3x, it's like in the 125 and a bit of the 150. Right. So what's that's telling us is that the 3-bet size that you're going to be using is going to be roughly the same regardless of what the open size was in terms of the number of chips that you put in. So against the 2x, if you make it 200%, then that's what is that? 200%. Yeah, 12. So button opens to 2, you're in the small blind, 3-bet it up to 12, or button opens to 2.5, you 3-bet to roughly 12. Button opens to 3, you 3-bet to roughly 12. Well, here it goes up to 150, which would be like 14. So the number of chips that you put in is going to be roughly the same. There is a bit of change, but it's going to be roughly the same. For the small blind. Now let's have a look at the big blind. So after the small blind folds, here we've got 200 and 250 against the 200 and 250, which are both liked against the min open, and so that would be between 12 and 14. The same kind of thing happens here. All the way up to 250, right? 250 would be roughly 14, okay, against the min open. Sorry, between 12 and 14, which is what's going on against the min open. Against the 2.5, spot one folds, 200, which is once again about 12. Tell you the exact number now. Yeah, 13.5. So against the 2.5, big blind will make it 13.5, and then sometimes 12. Against the 3x open, right? Yeah, 13 and 12.75. So you're using roughly the same number of chips for the 3-bet, regardless of which open size they use, and that should be somewhat reflective of the polarity that they've got. So if they open small, their range on average is going to be less polar, and so your 3-bet size is going to be bigger because you can make it more polar, right? Your 3-bet your 3-bet range is going to be more polar. You want to use a bigger size, and sort of vice versa. And roughly the range is, in terms of for the value range, is going to be roughly the same in terms of which kinds of hands. You've got like 9s and 8s plus. Ace Queen always makes it in regardless of what open size. King Queen, Ace Jack suited, they always, King suited and Ace Jack suited, they always make it in for value regardless of what the open size was, which is different to the current sims, the current ranges that I have up on Zenith, which show fair more flats with those kinds of hands. Yeah, and then bluffs appropriately. Particularly like 10-9 suited is fairly nice bluff in this spot for both the small one and the big blind. 10-9 suited in particular, like it wrecks the 6-5 on the it wrecks the 5-4 on the 8-7-6. Which is pretty good because and the button's always going to call the 5-4 against your 3-bet. Well, almost always going to call it against the button, and against the small blind, almost always going to call it. So that sort of gets 5-4 out of the way, and even 6-5, just because the 10-9 is still going to do reasonably well on like a 9-8-7, and then counterfeiting the 5, the 6-5 on a jack or something. The other thing is that 10-9 suit in particular, has that sort of double blocking effect on the 10s and 9s, which tends to be the top of the calling range, right? That's going to be the case for both the small blind and the big blind, regardless of what sizes are being used. If you get 10-9 into the 3-bet range, the button's not going to be 4-betting 10s and 9s very often, because 10s and 9s are going to be making, it's essentially going to be becoming the top of the calling range against your 3-bet. And the reason why that's important is because against the 4-bet you're just folding 10-9. So for example here, against the 2.5, fold, we're in the 3-bet, so when the big blind we 3-bet with the 10-9, 200%. Against the min, I guess we can call it, but against the jam we're definitely folding it. And against bigger sizes we're going to be much more happy to fold the 10-9 suited. So it's one of those hands, 10-9 suited, that does pretty well, blocking the calls, and has good threat potential both up and down. Yeah, like you can have a look at all the sort of broadways that against the 3-bet are going to be called. All the 10x suited, all the 9x suited, essentially, they're all going to be called. So 10-9 suited blocks a lot of calls. Double blocks a lot of calls. Yeah. What else is there? Yeah, so in terms of the 4-bet sizes, so let's say button opens at 2.5, big blind, sorry, small blind, we 3-bet up to 150, which is 150%. It should be like 12, right? Against this 4-bet, right? If the big blind wants to play, is going to be using the min 4-bet size, but the button in particular is going to be using relatively small sizes, so like min 60%. That's like around 2x, 2.1x, something like that. It's relatively small. So we go fold, and then the big blind 3-bets, a lot more min, a lot more min. So like the 4-bet size that you're going to be using against these big 3-bet sizes from the blinds is going to be relatively small, and that's because you want your opponent to be calling, instead of just being able to play jam or fold against you, right? If you make it too big, your opponent can essentially jam more often than they have to call. But if you make it small enough, you're forcing your opponent to have more of these calls. You're forcing your opponent to flat aces against you, in order to sort of protect the rest of their calling range against your min 4-bet. So yeah, this example that we're looking at here is button opens to 2.5, small blind folds, big blind 3-bets to 13.5, and then you've got the variety of different responses for the, you've got the response of the button against this 13.5 big blind 3-bet. You can click it back, and then, you know, with clicking it back, there's a fair amount of jams, and you lose your 24.5, or, you know, 60% to 30. But yeah, the 3-bet sizes are going to be like min or a little bit bigger than min, 2x, 2.1x, not bigger than that, because you end up allowing your opponent to play jam or fold against you if you go too big. Yeah, and in terms of different hands that do jam over the 4-bet, of course it depends on the size of the 4-bet, but it's roughly the same. Aces tends to flat. Hands which jam, those suited ace X, right, depending on, you know, exactly what the stack to pot ratio is, but nines to kings and ace king is the main bulk of the jamming range. There's some other hands, Lord ace queen suited, you know, those suited wheel aces kinds of stuff. Those can sometimes make it in there, and you'll see that throughout, right? Say we open to 2, and then the small blind 3-bets, and then there's a 4-bet. The small blind will 5-bet all in with 10s to kings, and ace king is the main bulk of it, and some other stuff, like the suited aces against a slightly bigger one, or against a slightly bigger 4-bet. Aces doesn't have to call as often, because the reason why aces calls is to protect the calling range. Against bigger 4-bets, you're not calling as often, and so aces doesn't have to call as often to protect the calling range. And so aces will jam more. Yeah, roughly the same. 10s to kings and ace king as the core of the 5-bet jamming range, and then some other stuff you can throw in here and there. Notice that it's all suited, not offsuit. Offsuit stuff just goes in the muck. Yeah. In terms of the 4-bet bluffs, the 4-bet bluffs just come from the edge of the range, that sort of in between calling and folding. Any questions about all of that? So that was quite a lot about the button versus small blind versus big blind. So we talked about the small blind flat and then re-jam, over the squeeze, talked a bit about 3-bet sizes and 4-bet sizes, and, you know, the 5-bet all-in range. Any questions about that? Anything you want me to look at? Anything you want me to look at again? No, it's a bit confusing.
In general, then, Thomas, with the smaller 4-bets are a result of the larger 3-bets in a way. Is that correct? The polarization that happens with the larger 3-bet, you can't 4-bet too, like you said, you can't 4-bet too high, because then you're just going to get jammed or folded.
Yeah.
But by 4-betting with the min, the kickback with the min actually keeps your opponent's range. He has to call a lot of stuff. I
mean, the 4-bet size in terms of the number of chips actually ends up being roughly the same, depending on what 3-bet size your opponent chooses. So say here we open a 2.5, and then your opponent in the big blind pots it as a 3-bet. Our 4-bet size here is actually 80%, so that's much bigger than min, right? It's roughly twice the size as a min, but it ends up being roughly the same number of big blinds that goes in, only 21.2. Right, and if you look at the other ones, it's like between 20 22.5 big blinds that goes in as the 4-bet, right? And that's sort of regardless of what size that your opponent chooses for their 3-bet. So if they use the correct size for their 3-bet, you're still going to be 4-betting like to a size like 22.5 big blinds. Maybe 25 big blinds, but 25 big blinds is getting a bit too big.
Right.
Like here, you open to 3, opponent 3-bets you to a big one. Yeah, only min. And a bit of min and 4.7. Maybe if I let the sim run longer, it wouldn't have any of these calls, but maybe there is a bit of calling against the 3-bet. Maybe there is a bit of cold calling. There's not a lot of cold calling on average, right? As a big blind against the 3-bet. I mean, there is some, but yeah, don't expect you don't have to have these calls. All these hands that are called can either be folded or 3-bet as an alternative, and have either fold or 4-bet as an alternative and have good results. Once again, a bit of jamming. All right, there is a tad of just ripping it against a 3-bet as well on the button, so remember that. And yeah, once again, the same kinds of hands: 10s, queen jack suited, and ace king offsuit. That sort of 3-hand combination against a small blind is used there. 10s, jacks, queen jack suited, and ace king off. Against a small blind, against a big blind, the same kind of stuff. 10s, queen jack suited, ace queen offsuit, ace king offsuit, ace 5 suited. Those hands can all make a jam as a 4-bet as well. So you got like the min 4-bet or the 2x 4-bet kind of stuff going on with the bulk of your range, and then some jams just to keep your opponent, some jams with select hands just to keep your opponent honest, kind of thing. Keep your opponent in check with their range, because if their 3-bet range isn't sufficiently polar for the size that they use, or is too polar for the size that they use, the combination of having like a small 4-bet and jams in your strategy just annihilates your opponent, because when one happens, your opponent's range can't adapt enough, and when the other happens, your opponent's range can't adapt enough. So overall, it forces your opponent to play more correctly, or face the consequences of your ripping it in with ace king, and then your opponent has to overfold or underfold or something like that.
Awesome. This is really interesting. This is really cool.
Yeah. Any other questions before we move on to the cutoff? I mean, we go through it all. It's like roughly 45%. It's like 45% is the top, 44% is the opening for the button, and for the small blind, little over 50% with the calls. All right, and now so we've got the cutoff. So cutoff here, it says ETG, but it's cutoff. Little over 30%, which is actually a fair bit more than a lot of ranges would suggest, and even Snowy does like 29%. But other sims like here, if we look at this 6-way stuff, 28.6. I mean, that's the 6-way. Oh, this is a pretty dodgy sim. Anyway, going back to this, cutoff a little over 30% as the opening size, and that's what it looks like. The higher the rake, the more it shifts towards suited aces, offsuit aces, and the lower the rake, the less of the offsuit aces that are being used, and more of the suited connectors. And we're looking at 5% gapped at 1, which is sort of medium-ish rake. So you got a combination of the two. They're ace-8 offsuits being used in there, as well as a few of the suited connectors with the 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, and 5-4 suited. The thing is, the open size that's chosen here, again at 3 sizes, min, 2.5, and 3, and it basically always uses min. So we're just going to be looking at that. 3 is very rarely used, and 2.5 it's sometimes used, but not often. And it could be the case that this 3 is also clumping together anything bigger than 3 as well. That you might think of doing. So like a combination of 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 X opens, they're just never being used. So I'd imagine that bigger open sizes than 2.5 are quite rare. So 2.5, sticking closer to 2 is going to be your bread and butter in the cutoff. And the reason behind that is that the button's going to flat sometimes, and you just don't like that. You're going to be playing out of position, it's not great. Or the button's going to 3-bet you, it's even worse. Then you're playing a 3-bet pot out of position, right? It's better to go for a small size, hope that the button folds, and then you're playing in position against the blinds, right? Not only are you playing in position against the blinds, you're playing in position against a relatively wide big blind range, which is great. You've got tight range, big blind's very wide. You can leverage that post flop, and you risk the least in the cases that the button wakes up with a good hand and 3-bets you or even flats, right? So let's focus on that. So 2x open, here these are the ranges that either 3-bet or call. So here on the top right, you've got the button, some rare flats with the pocket pairs, but the weakest pocket pair that always continues is 6s. 5s is sort of getting in there for the button. And you can see that there is some polarity in the 3-bet range. You've got like ace-2 suited, always being 3-bet, ace-10 offsuit, always being 3-bet, queen-jack offsuit, always being 3-bet instead of calling. So those kinds of hands are very much towards the bottom of the button's continuing range against the cutoff, and so those hands are always going to be 3-betting. And similarly, there's king-8 suited, king-7 suited kind of stuff, and even queen-9 suited, which is a nice hand, but against the cutoff open of 30%, it's not quite as amazing. So yeah, you can look at the calls. You know, the sort of middling pocket pairs are called roughly half the time, and sort of ace-10 suited and queen-10 suited kind of stuff being called a bit more. But the hands that always 3-bet for value are going to be like jacks plus and ace-king and ace-queen suited, which is, sort of expected. We'll have a quick look at the button's continuing calling range against a squeeze. So button calls, and then the small blind and the big blind have roughly the same squeezing range against a call, and roughly the same number of chips that they put in as well. So let's just have a look at this. So for the let's just assume that the small blind folds, and then the big blind goes and makes the squeeze. So this is cutoff open. We flatten in the button, and then the big blind squeezes twice the pot, which is fairly big, but yep. You notice that these are the two ranges, the cutoff continuing quite tight, and the button here we're also continuing quite tight as well. And these reds are jams, right? So when we do choose to 4-bet over the squeeze after we have the flat, it's going to be as a jam. And the choice of and it's quite rare because ace, king, and jacks are pretty close to always 3-bet. So there, it's okay to have this sort of flat in position kind of thing. Mainly because if they make it too small, you can just flat quite wide, and then your ranges sufficiently wide to not have to have the 4-bet, right? And part of that reason is because the cutoff is still uncapped and then can 4-bet. So yeah, the cutoff's going to make a good bulk of the of the 4-bets for you. So you don't have to worry too much about having a back jam range in the button as often. And part of that, and the main reason why that's the case is because you're still in position against the 3-better. Yeah, the strong hands like queens, kings, aces, and ace king suited. The EV of flatting and hoping that the either blind squeezes so you can back jam, it just isn't there. Compared to 3-betting. And the reason why that's the case is because the cutoff range is quite tight. So the small blind and the big blind collectively aren't even going to be 3-betting you that often. Here, once it goes call fold, it's only 10-ish%. So small blind is going to be squeezing you 10-ish%. Big blind's going to be squeezing you 10-ish%. So what does that mean? So it's a 20-ish% squeeze if you just, so let's say you decided to flat aces against the cutoff open, you're going to get squeezed 20%. So the action is going to reopen 20% of the time. But if you 3-bet, the cutoff is going to 4-bet you 20% of the time anyway. So with those very strong hands, it just makes sense to just 3-bet because you're not going to get squeezed anywhere near enough to justify 3-betting and then getting 4-bet by the cutoff with a strong hand that you want to get in with. In terms of the 3-bet size that the button makes, I've given between 75 and 100, so roughly 3x, and it's also roughly 3x against the bigger sizes as well. But even the big sizes aren't used very often. So yeah, let's say the button folds, right? Actually, let's continue with the button first. Let's say the button 3-bets, okay? Even though I've given optional calls to small blind and big blind, never being used. So there's no cold calling out of position against the 3-bet, right? So cutoff opens, button 3-bets, there's no cold calling. Even against the smaller 3-bets, there's still no cold calling. Right, so don't cold call 3-bet out of position. Is sort of that. You can see the ranges are roughly the same between the two. The range is also roughly the same, regardless of what 3-bet size is used, and also it changes a little bit depending on the open size. So those are the two ranges. So here, small blind, big blind, you can see they're roughly the same. Big blind slightly more often than the small blind, which is what you would expect, right? With the small blind, there's still the big blind to worry about, but the big blind only has to worry about the cutoff. So that's why the small blind folds a bit more. And then going back to the cutoff, right up here. So let's say small blind folds, big blind folds, looking at the cutoff. Here, this is the continuing range and the 4-bets. You know, the good chunk of it is the 10s plus ace king, but ace queen offset as a bluff, there's other stuff as a bluff, and then it ends up being roughly 20-ish%. Okay, against the cutoff, against the big blind 3-bet. So the button 3-bet, and against a bigger 3-bet to pot sized 3-bet, same kind of thing. tens plus, ace queen, sorry, ace king, and then a little bit of ace queen offsuit as a bluff, and some other junk as a bluff. All right, so do you want to look against a 4-bet? I guess we're going to look against a 4-bet. So say we're on the button, and then we 3-bet to 3x, and then we get 4-bet, pot-sized 4-bet. Once again, it's same kind of thing with the flatting of the aces to protect the calling range. We're in position, so we're still going to be calling relatively wide despite the fact that they potted it into us. But they're continuing, the hands that would continue as a jam that you got between min and jam against a min. It's going to be quite difficult for your opponent to continue. So there you've got like kings and ace king suited as the min, but queens and ace king off as the jam. So something to think about. Of course, if you min it and then get jammed into, you're calling with basically everything that you that can withstand it. So pocket pairs and ace king. Yeah, against slightly smaller 4-bet, you see the same kind of thing going on, a little bit more aces there. So don't be afraid to min 5-bet your opponent if you know what you're doing. So against the 4-bet, right? So here we're looking like 2, 6.125 or 6 and a bit, and then they 3-bet to like 20ish, 19. If you min it, yeah, 20. You're going to min it to a little less than 40. Sorry, 33.625. Still, yeah, minning it, getting in roughly a third of the stack, and then still folding with ace queen. So yeah, they got a little bit ace queen offsuit, goes for the min 4-bet, and then fold to a jam, despite the fact that you put a third of your stack in. And the reason why is because the jamming range is just like tens plus ace king, which ace queen offsuit does terribly against. So ace queen can do that as a bluff. Ace queen suited can't really do that as a bluff because ace queen suited just has too much equity, so it has to end up calling the jam, which just sucks because ace queen would just rather call the 4-bet than min 5-bet than call 6-bet jam. So yeah, any questions about that? See that the same kind of things going on. Between min and jam. Ace queen off, queens and jacks goes for the jam. Kings and ace king suited goes for the min. As well as some other stuff. And aces calling depending on how often you have to go. Sorry?
The king 9 there on the cutoff suited, that's like a min fold to a jam, right? It's a blocker type.
Yeah, so this is a cutoff open to 2, button 3-bets to 6.125 or a little over 6, 2 folds, and then the cutoff 4-bets to a little less than 20. Here, the king 9 suited, mins, and then folds to a jam.
Right.
Sometimes.
And versus a button 3-bet, the cutoff is 4-betting at a much higher frequency, right? Than it calls.
No. So here against the button 3-bet to 3x, you got a 4-bet range of roughly 20%, a little over 20%, and a calling range of 25%. Frequency against a slightly bigger 3-bet. Yeah, there's a little over 21% 4-bet and much less calls. 12.7% calls against a bigger 3-bet.
Right.
So yeah, and against an even bigger 3-bet, bigger than 100, I would imagine that you got almost no calling range and only four betting. Or if there is a calling range, it's going to be like ace queen suited, king queen suited, ace jack suited, and really some other stuff. Alright, so that was cutoff open button 3-bet. So look what happens after the button folds. Yeah, button folds is same kind of ideas that we looked at for the button opens. The sizes chosen for the small blind against our min open and the cutoff. The small blind chooses roughly 200, big blind chooses roughly 250% as the raise. Right, so 200, that would be to 12, right? And then the big blind goes to 13. So we're talking like 6x, 6.5x, 7x. Totally acceptable sizes to use. But you know, if you're not comfortable, probably go closer to 6x for both small blind and big blind against the cutoff min open. And yeah, have a relatively polar range. So here in the small blind, you know, plenty of flats with those pocket pairs, and then only really starting to raise when it gets up to 9s, 10s, jacks, and then always raising queens plus ace king. Similarly in the big blind, flats all the way up to 10s, and then it's jacks plus and ace queen plus. Essentially always gets it in. Gets it in as a 3-bet, and then let's have a look at particularly against the min 4-bet, right, which is sort of what we would expect. Min 5-betting it back with aces and some selected bluffs. Ace 10 offsuit in particular. The reason why ace 10 offsuit is in there, I don't know, because it's not really there for the big blind. Yeah, so it's not really there, so it's not really important. But like aces as the min 5-bet, and then yeah, playing forward as the min 5-bet with some of the jacks and king jack. Not really quite as often as the jam, and calling is pretty rare. Sorry to get this right. Yeah. And then calling is pretty rare, 6.5% against the min 4-bet. Right. Mostly playing jam or fold with the jacks to kings and ace king and little ace 5 suited. That's got to, and that reflects the polarity in the big blinds 3-bet range. The fact that you basically not having any calls against even a min 4-bet, and then just re-raising. The big blinds 3-bet range here is so polar. This is sort of what the min 4-bet ranges looks like for the cutoff. Very big, right? They're popping up to 6, 6.5, 7. You're folding 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s. Similarly against the small blind. Right, once the big blind folds, folding these weaker pocket pairs. Right, it's a very big 6x 3-bet. Folding these weaker pocket pairs, going for the min 4-bet, and then getting jammed on a fair chunk of the time. 30-ish% of the time getting jammed on, while getting minned 10% of the time and called 10% of the time. So there's not quite as much calling there. Right. Yeah, so fold there. So you can see once again here in position, the same bit strange table. There's suited kings rather than suited aces, but it's a mix of the two. This is sort of what the big blind does against the 3-bet from the small blind, continuing quite tight. Some cold calls, noting that here we're cold calling in position versus when the button 3-bets we're cold calling out of position. So out of position cold calls against 3-bet, big no. But in position you can get away with it. If you do decide to cold call and then you get minned, you just you're kind of fucked. So yeah, that's why the cold calling range is so small. Yeah. And yeah, once again, the 4-bet size chosen for the big blind is min as well. Expecting it to get jammed on a fair chunk of the time. Is that all I want to talk about? Yeah. So any questions about that? Against the cutoff open, very polar from the blinds with a very big size, and then you're talking min 4-bets, and then getting jammed on a good chunk of the time. So yeah, any questions about cutoff opening and the responses to it? And cutoff is going to be once you understand cutoff, hijack isn't too much of a leap, and then lowjack once again very similar.
The min raise is very interesting. I'm going to have questions, but this is such a lot to take in. I'll be posting questions, I think, in the tutorial section.
Yeah, this is recorded, so it'll be up soon. Alright, so yeah, what I went through is some sims that have a good variety of sizes, which is more important for a human to have, know roughly what the correct sizes and what the correct sizes are and roughly what the correct range is for those sizes, than it is to be perfectly accurate within 0.5% with our frequencies. So for that reason, that's the reason why I'm running these sims with a decent accuracy with less focus on precision. Because as long as you can play close enough, you're going to do quite well against other human players, rather than trying to worry about every percentage that you in terms of which hand goes for what percent where. That's not very important for a human. What's more important is knowing roughly what hands, roughly what frequencies, rather than the exact frequencies. So yeah, there's no more questions. I think that's all the sims I got. We're not going to let the 6-way because I don't own them technically. So those aren't the ones that I made, and also they're kind of shit. So let's not look at them. But I'll be adding another small one versus big blind. I've got it running right now. Probably next week soon. So that'll be up with it'll be high accuracy with a higher precision, I guess. It's not even high accuracy, but it'll just confirm everything from this sim. And then also another cutoff sim. I think. Just to confirm everything from this. And then, yeah, I might run that a bit more because I didn't run this deep enough. So maybe some of the 4-bit, 5-bit stuff is going to be pretty bad. That's why I labeled it medium precision, poor accuracy or something like that, because the accuracy is because the precision in this is pretty low. So once you get to like 4-bit, 5-bit, you're not entirely sure on what hands goes where. So for this next one, it'll be medium accuracy, hopefully medium precision. For the next cutoff open, and then after cutoff open, might start to add, well, definitely will actually start to add hijack and lowjack, and it'll just be maybe the 2x and 2.5x, because we've seen here from the cutoff that 3x is never used. So what's the point of even adding it into the to low jack and hijack, I'm just wasting RAM. Yeah. So no more questions. I guess we'll call that the end of this tutorial. Hopefully you guys learned something. The recording will be up soon, and people who are watching this later at home, thanks for watching and making it through to the end.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you.